This is U.S. History 1, Lecture 1.4, continuing the discussion of the American Revolution. And as we've done, we pick up exactly where we left off. We left off with just kind of a synopsis of what this is, and now we'll go into the detail. This is now fall of 1777. Setting up the nearly disastrous winter at Valley Forge of 77-78. And it should be perhaps parenthetically noted that almost simultaneously with this, Gates and Arnold are in the north in the Hudson Valley up in the Adirondacks in Saratoga, achieving the first decisive strategic victory for the Americans in the Revolution. And while they're busy achieving decisive strategic victory, Washington busies himself by getting his ass kicked across the state of Pennsylvania. But at any rate. Okay, so here we see the situation. Howe decides at this point to take seriously the attack on Philadelphia, and rather than marching south across the state of New Jersey and then crossing the Delaware to take Philadelphia, which is a difficult undertaking, he will launch another amphibious invasion. Remember, he had launched the amphibious attack on New York successfully. So he's going to launch another amphibious attack. This time he's going to come up the Chesapeake, just north of Baltimore Harbor, and land his troops here, march north with the intention of taking Philadelphia. Washington will stand across the Brandywine with a superior force. And once again, as we've seen Washington do before, we saw him do this in New York, while the British are maneuvering into position, Washington doesn't do a thing. Okay, he squanders his tactical and strategic advantage. He allows Howe's army to cross the Brandywine River rather than attempting to oppose it. Now, there were only a couple of crossing points, and Washington could easily have opposed him at these points, but instead, Washington just sits tight, perhaps gripped by an indecision of what to do as Howe crosses the Brandywine. There will be a series of sharp engagements. The first of them will be at Brandywine, just across the river. The second will be north in Germantown. Washington loses the first one, is forced to march north, crossing the river. Howe will pursue and, in another decisive engagement, defeat him at Germantown, where Washington will then be forced to withdraw across the river to Valley Forge, while Howe runs and sacks Philadelphia. At which point, during this period, the Continental Congress will be forced to evacuate Philadelphia and take up a position in Lancaster. And Washington's fear is that now the British will march across Pennsylvania to take Lancaster and seize the Continental Congress. And of course, as I made mention of earlier, we must remember that all of the members of the Continental Congress are treasonous dogs, as the phrase would be. They're in full rebellion against the British Empire, and if caught, they would all be hung. And so it's a reasonable concern. But again, what we see here, and what we'll see also, if you go to the History Animated discussion of the tactical situation and the details of the tactical engagements, what you'll see is that in both Brandywine and Germantown, as in New York, there will be a series of tactical errors made by the Americans, okay? In every case, Washington is going to blame the defeat on his subordinates. This is a demonstration of a lack of leadership ability, okay? The fact of the matter is, he's captain of the vessel. If he's captain of the vessel and something goes wrong, it's on him. It's that simple. That's one of the true marks of a great leader, is that they don't blame their subordinates. When their subordinates screw up, they take it. Okay? It's what Harry S. Truman said, the buck stops here. It was one of the uncomfortable things. You know, I mentioned to you before that I was a cook for 20 years I was a cook. Some of those engagements I was head chef. Okay, I was executive chef. Well, the unfortunate thing about that, and what a lot of people don't seem to understand, is that as head chef, I'm in charge of the kitchen. Anything that happens in that kitchen is on me. No matter what it is, no matter who does it, no matter who's responsible, it's on me because I'm overall commander. Okay? And so I have a responsibility to make sure everything runs smoothly, not George. Okay, George issues this series, which you'll see in the detail of the tactical engagements. George issues this series of extremely complicated tactical maneuvers. Okay, which his subordinates are just not able to execute correctly. And then he blames them rather than blaming the plan itself. Now we have to remember that what Washington is dealing with at this time, he seems to not understand. He is dealing with a hastily assembled hodgepodge of colonial militias, all of whom are poorly trained. He thinks he's acting as though he's dealing with a trained, disciplined European-style army, and he's not. Okay? And he doesn't seem to appreciate that. In Saratoga, conversely, Gates and Arnold understand that. They know who they're dealing with. And so their tactical engagement, their approach to the battle, their plan, was based on that information, was based on what your troops are like. Washington's weren't. Washington, in other words, Washington was going to war with the army he wanted rather than the army he had. And so he'll lose both of these and be driven to Valley Forge. Now, the Valley Forge situation is an extremely desperate one for the colonial army. It comes close to disintegration. It's an extremely harsh winter. Okay, large numbers of the troops suffer from frostbite. Starvation is breaking out. They're in desperate shape. However, as decisive a strategic victory as Saratoga was, something even more decisive on a strategic level is going to happen at Valley Forge. At Valley Forge, the colonial army will be converted to a continental army, not by George Washington. George Washington does nothing. He'll sit there for the winter. But the colonial army is joined by a Prussian general by the name of von Steuben, a soldier of fortune. He does not do this with the sanctioning of the Prussian government by any stretch of the imagination. He is a soldier of fortune. Okay, not really a mercenary. He's not really being paid by the Americans. He's a soldier of fortune. He's seeking adventure. He comes to Valley Forge in the winter of 77-78 and devotes himself to training the colonial army. And so when the spring of 78 comes up, and the British will underestimate this. The British do not accurately estimate the impact that this is going to have. From 78 onwards, we're no longer going to be dealing with this colonial hodgepodge of militias. We're going to be dealing with a disciplined, trained army, trained in the Prussian military tradition. Okay? And so it's going to be a completely different ballgame. Washington, of course, for his part, will fail to exploit this. When the action turns to the Southern Theater, which we'll see in a minute here, the commanders down there, mostly Daniel Morgan and Nathaniel Greene, will not fail to take advantage of the newly seasoned army that they have at their disposal. As I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, after the victories at Germantown and Brandywine, Howe is going to be replaced. Now, there's a number of reasons for Howe to be replaced. Howe is not particularly politically popular in England. Largely, the course of the war, while generally successful for the British so far, hasn't met King George's timetable. He wants this taken care of quickly. And so they largely blame Howe for the delay. They blame Howe for not pursuing and destroying Washington's army after the victory at Germantown. And so they rather unfairly blame Howe for the strategic position, even though it's inadvantageous. They blame Howe for the defeat at Saratoga and in the Saratoga campaign, although for reasons that we've already discussed in the previous lecture, it really wasn't Howe's responsibility. He never received orders to support the offensive in Saratoga, and so he'll be replaced by Clinton somewhat unfairly. Now, Clinton will immediately come to the conclusion, correctly probably, that supporting the British position in Philadelphia is a very difficult proposition. You have this entire distance from Philadelphia to the British headquarters, their main stronghold in New York. You have this entire logistical support line. Now, in the winter of 76 and 77, Washington demonstrated that it's a very vulnerable position. Washington was able to cross the Delaware and take a couple of the garrisons. This demonstrated its strategic difficulty, the vulnerability of this position, which Clinton now recognizes, and he'll make the decision to evacuate Philadelphia and move back to New York. And as much as I've been beating up old George here, as I mentioned early on in the beginnings of the Revolution, the British seem to have generally fostered an underestimation of the ability of the colonial army and the American commanders. And so the one thing that Washington does contribute to this is he contributes to this impression by screwing up in the Battle of New York, by screwing up at Brandywine, by screwing up at Germantown, by having an army that virtually disintegrates underneath him. Okay, he contributes to the overall British impression that the Americans are inept boobs. The British are able to excuse the failure at Saratoga to a failure on Howe's part to support the position and to terrain. Largely, they blame the defeat on the terrain of northern New York, which defeated their army. And so they're able to excuse that, and so it doesn't shift the impression that the American army is incompetent. Okay, Washington's ineptitude as a commander certainly fosters that impression. Okay, nonetheless, Clinton comes to the conclusion that under an adequate commander, this British vulnerability between Philadelphia and New York could easily be exploited. And so he decides two things. Ultimately, he decides to turn the war to the Southern theater. Now, I'll go over in a minute why he does this. Okay? But in order to do this, he has to consolidate his forces in New York and then launch an amphibious attack down in the Carolinas. Okay? The only way he can do that is to evacuate Philadelphia. So he's going to evacuate Philadelphia so that he can consolidate his forces for the upcoming Southern offensive, and so that he can reduce the vulnerability of the British strategic position in the north. Okay? Now, the Southern offensive, which I'll get to in just a minute, has been taking place for a little while. The first siege of Charleston was in 76, and it was unsuccessful. In 77, when the French intervene, their fleet makes it untenable for the small amount of British forces that they've devoted to this to actually prevail. Now, when Clinton decides to evacuate Philadelphia and move to New York, Washington attempts to exploit this, as he should. This is definitely an exploitable position. Okay? However, in typical fashion, Washington will screw it up. And he'll screw it up very much in the same fashion that his poor advice way back when to Braddock in 1754-55 in the French and Indian War will screw up the Battle of Monongahela. At length, there is a debate that breaks out among Washington's generals, and this demonstrates a certain indecisiveness on Washington's part, which we've seen before. Okay, it was perhaps the indecisiveness that led Washington to allow the British to land in New York in the first place without any opposition. He was trying to decide what to do. It was his indecisiveness that allowed Howe to march his army all the way across the Brandywine River. It was his indecisiveness all along that has led to this situation. Well, once again, we're seeing Washington's indecisiveness. Okay? And so his general staff is arguing over what to do. The one argument is do nothing. Let him evacuate Philadelphia. We'll retake Philadelphia, reestablish the capital. Everything will be good. We won't lose anybody. We don't need to march after him. The other is pursue him aggressively, attempt to engage decisively Clinton's army. Okay? Ultimately, Washington is going to plunk for this plan. The problem is that while Washington is indecisive and trying to come to when he's debating this with his general staff and with himself, as he's debating this with himself, Clinton's army is evacuating Philadelphia and moving north across the state of New Jersey. So by the time Washington actually makes his decision to pursue he's closing the barnyard door after the horses run away. It's too late. And so Washington will move his army as quickly as he can across the Delaware in an attempt to blaze a trail north and engage Clinton's army somewhere in northern New Jersey. The problem is that because of the indecision, he's now behind schedule. He's not going to be able to catch Clinton's army. And so he makes a strategic blunder. He makes an absolutely idiotic move, for which he's now characterized, which is now characteristic of him, right? And it's very similar to what he does in Monongahela. If you remember from the French and Indian War, Washington manages to convince Braddock, as they're marching along the Nemacolin Trail up towards Monongahela, Washington convinces Braddock to leave his heavy artillery behind, to leave the heavy force behind, to slog through the woods while a lightning-fast force moves north and invests Fort Duquesne. He's going to make a similar blunder here. He leaves the main body of his army with the artillery behind to slowly come up through New Jersey, while he launches a lightning force north to try to delay Clinton's army long enough for the main body of the Continental Army to come up and join the battle. Okay? His lightly assembled force, and it's a hastily assembled force of a collection of what is now the Continental Army, of Continental units, will ultimately meet Clinton's army at Monmouth in northern New Jersey. And there's insufficient force to decisively engage Clinton. Clinton will fight a minor rearguard action and then take the bulk of his force back to New York successfully long before the main body of Washington's army comes up. And then we'll have the most mysterious thing of all take place. We're now dealing with the summer of 78. By the fall of 78, Clinton is back in New York safe and sound and is now beginning to engage in the South. He's preparing his amphibious assault of the South. We will hear from this point forward, from the fall of 78 onwards, really from the late summer of 78 onwards, we will not hear anything of George Washington. George Washington will, from that point forward in the war, sit in northern New Jersey. The next time we'll hear Washington's name is in October of 81 at the Siege of Yorktown. The question, of course, is why? What is George doing for these 3 years? Well, the one thing is he's desperately attempting to keep his army from mutiny, okay, which he successfully does. He successfully does, among other things, by executing a large number of them. He decimates his force at one point. He executes 1 in 10 to maintain discipline and prevent them from mutiny. And the other thing is, and this, again, is something that is debatable among historians, okay? It's speculative, but it would appear that by the summer of 78, after the series of defeats that Washington has suffered, and after his inability to pursue and decisively engage Clinton on his way to New York, the Continental Congress has finally come to the conclusion that Washington is an incompetent, okay? And so they can't remove him as commander-in-chief. Remember, originally, the reason they put him in as commander-in-chief was because they needed the southern colonies. They still need the southern colonies, now more than ever as the action turns south. And so they can't replace him. So they effectively neutralize him. They order him to sit in New York, or in New Jersey, outside of New York, and just watch Clinton's army. Okay? And so for the next 3 years, Washington will do nothing. Now, in the Southern theater, here's the basic idea that Clinton is working with, and it's a reasonable hypothesis. The British know that the Southern colonies were not particularly well disposed towards joining the revolution. Clinton's impression, which works out to be mistaken, is that when the British arrive in South Carolina and Georgia and begin to march north through the Carolinas and through the southern colonies, the loyalists in the Carolinas, the loyalists in the South, will rally to the British cause and support their position and join them as militias. Okay? Reasonable enough. To defend against this, and we'll take a look at this in maps in just a second. To defend against this, the colonials place Horatio Gates, hero of Saratoga, in command of Continental forces. Now, we look at the strategic position. Clinton's fleet will come this way. They've already taken Savannah. They take Savannah in early 77. Okay? They march north and ultimately besiege Charleston and take it. It's the largest single-day loss in American history. Okay? Until the Second World War. It will be the largest single-day loss of American forces in American history. From Charleston, they will march north and create a series of forts in South Carolina. To some degree, Clinton's impression is confirmed here. There will be loyalists that join them, about 1,100 of them. So he thinks he's on a roll. Gates will march south with his army. Cornwallis is now in command of the British army in the south and will march north to meet him and decisively defeat Gates at Camden, which will force Gates's army into retreat and will cost Gates his command. And this kind of leads credence to that idea. Remember I mentioned that the British partially blame terrain for their defeat in the Saratoga campaign rather than the tactical abilities of Arnold and Gates. That may be true because here they're on a level playing field tactically. You don't have the same kind of terrain you have in the northern Adirondacks, and at which point Gates's army is defeated decisively. So maybe there's some credence to what they're suggesting, but it's going to feed again their overconfidence, which is going to come back to haunt them. Particularly when it's Gates's command. Gates is going to lose his command. It's going to be taken over by Nathaniel Greene, who has probably the best tactical commander as his adjutant, Daniel Morgan, who we'll deal with in a minute. It's going to come back to haunt them because they're going to underestimate Greene and Morgan. Now, the tactical situation, and this is just kind of to give you an idea. Greene has now taken over the army and is here. However, with the defeat at Camden and with the long march south that Greene had to make, the Continental Army is depleted in terms of its resources. Okay, it's running short of supplies. So Greene is going to send Daniel Morgan westward to forage for supplies. Cornwallis, positioned here just south of Charlotte, this is Charlotte, North Carolina, okay, receives intelligence that Greene has dispatched Morgan to move south and threaten the western flank of the British army, particularly with a little fort down here, just down off the map here. It's on the other map, but it's down south here, called 96. The British have built one of their forts. Cornwallis gets intelligence that Morgan is being sent south to take the forts in South Carolina and threaten Cornwallis's line of communications and logistical support from Charleston, and perhaps attempt to encircle the British army. Cornwallis can't allow this. He'll dispatch a guy by the name of Tarleton westward, okay, to confront Daniel Morgan. Greene will stay here just south of Salisbury as a decoy to pin down Cornwallis's forces. Tarleton will move west. Daniel Morgan, in a series of forced marches, will move southwest, and cross this river here, at the Broad River, the West Fork of the Broad River, and take up a strategically advantageous position north of a place called Cowpens, which is actually called Hannah's Cowpens, right here, okay, which will set up the Battle of Cowpens. Okay, and this now, okay, goes over what I've just talked about. You can read that on your own, and we'll move forward to the Battle of Cowpens. Okay, this is the Dan River campaign and setting up the Battle of Cowpens. Cornwallis dispatches Tarleton to catch and destroy Morgan's force near the Dan River. Okay, actually closer to the Broad River. Morgan suddenly turns on pursuers and establishes a favorable defensive position at Hannah's Cowpens. He will employ a Battle of Cannae strategy, which I'll go over presently. Now, here's the Battle of Cowpens. This demonstrates the tactical wizardry, okay? Beyond Gates and Arnold and their victories at Ticonderoga and Saratoga, which at least partially can be uh, 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 attributed to the difficult terrain the British were facing. There is no such excuse here for the British. Okay, this is going to be a stand-up toe-to-toe fight with roughly even forces. This demonstrates Morgan's tactical wizardry. Okay, so we want to go over it. Morgan has an army comprised of two types of forces. He has poorly trained, undisciplined militia. Okay, and he has disciplined, trained Continentals, trained by von Steuben at Valley Forge. He decides to play a canaille strategy, and I'll explain that. The idea is, here comes Tarleton and the British forces. Now, part of, and this really gets to Sun Tzu's Art of War, part of the basic idea of Sun Tzu is to allow the enemy to see what they expect to see. The British underestimate the ability of the American forces. We know that. Okay? What the British anticipate seeing is what they've seen before. Once the American militias are confronted with the disciplined, trained British army, they will turn tail and run. And so Morgan positions in the front line his militia. The militia is ordered. Okay, what the plan is, the militia will fire 2 volleys, boom, boom, okay, at the British. The British will fire back. When the British will fire back, we are going to give Tarleton exactly what he anticipates seeing. The militias will break ranks. They will run away. They will run this way. Okay? Now, this is why Morgan positioned his army where he did. The militias will not be able to completely retreat from battle. They can't because the Broad River is right here. They can't cross the river. They'll have no choice but to reassemble here and come back this way. The Continentals are on a high position. The Broad River is here. This is in a valley. This is the high ground. So he has his Continentals positioned on the high ground. When the militia breaks, the British will now over-pursue. They'll dive directly into the Continental force, which they don't know is a disciplined Continental army. Okay, he takes advantage of this. They break immediately into the Continental force, which does not break ranks, which holds ranks, and proceeds to lambaste them with an artillery and musketry barrage, and the British begin to take heavy casualties. This is a complete shock to Tarleton. Tarleton at this point doesn't know what the hell's going on, and as he's trying to reassemble his forces, and again, look at the tactical details on the History Animated site. This group of militia, which has broken from the beginning of the battle, is reassembled back here and now marches in good order to take up a position on the west flank of the British. As they come up this way, on the British west flank, Tarleton is now faced with the possibility of encirclement, and he panics. Okay? He assembles as much of his army as he can and beats a hasty retreat south. The remaining forces are caught between the militia, which has now taken up a position here, and the disciplined Continentals here, and the remaining forces have to surrender. It is the most, in terms of a individual tactical engagement, it is the most decisive victory of the American Revolution. And the funny thing about it is, Daniel Morgan is never even mentioned. You never hear about him. You know, we sit there at Robert Morris University, and all of the buildings and everything's all named after, Yorktown Hall, after a famous battle. We've got, Hale, and we've got all these different... We don't have one for Daniel Morgan, okay? And Daniel Morgan was the tactical wizard that developed the tactical advantage at Cowpens. And after this, Cornwallis's army will never recover. This is a decisive tactical engagement. In the aftermath, okay, and just real quickly to go over the aftermath, Tarleton takes what's left of his force back north towards Charleston, okay, and reassembles with Cornwallis and offers Cornwallis his resignation. Tarleton feels like an absolute moron after this battle. He was outmaneuvered. Okay, this is something, what you have to understand is the British psyche. All along in the war, the British have treated the Americans like incompetent boobs. This impression has been fed by the ineptitude of George Washington. Well, there's no excuse here. Tarleton was beaten in a stand-up fight. He was simply outsmarted. Okay? He was tactically outmaneuvered. And there's no way around that. And so, psychologically, he's just broken. He can't imagine that these guys possibly could have won. And so he offers Cornwallis refuses the resignation, says, don't panic, we'll bring things together. Meanwhile, Morgan now begins to march north to relink with Greene's force and force a decisive engagement against Cornwallis. Greene is now going to demonstrate his strategic and tactical brilliance. He's going to march north. Okay? Cornwallis now seeks to, you have a divided American army. You have Morgan marching north to hook up with Greene. Greene marching north in an apparent retreat across the Dan River. In point of fact, what Greene's doing is pulling Cornwallis into a trap. Okay? Cornwallis marches north, okay, and begins to try to approach Greene's army before it crosses the Dan River. He wants to catch Greene before he crosses the Dan River. The problem is he's behind. The only way he can catch Greene's army is to destroy his baggage camp. And so he leaves his heavy artillery behind. He burns his wagons so that his remaining force can move quickly to approach Greene. Now, if he had instead done that and turned west to stop Morgan from linking up with Greene, it might have been a different conclusion. But, hindsight is 20/20, and we don't know what would have happened. Instead, he pursues Greene. Greene outmaneuvers him and crosses the Dan River. When he crosses the Dan River, Cornwallis now stops for a minute. He delays. He's not sure what to do. He doesn't want to risk crossing the Dan River with Greene's superior force against him in a tactically superior position, because they could cut him to ribbons as he crosses the dam. Okay, so he decides whether he wants to do that or turn back and try to engage Morgan. Well, while he's making this decision, Greene does a masterful operation. He turns his army on a dime and recrosses the Dan River. And so all of a sudden, as Cornwallis is preparing to turn west to try to engage Morgan and split the American army, Morgan, meanwhile, has, through a series of forced marches, made better time than than Cornwallis has anticipated. And Greene and Morgan will reform their army, okay, at a place called Guilford Courthouse, okay? Cornwallis will now move west. Greene and Morgan have established themselves in a tactically superior position at Guilford. Cornwallis will attempt to assail this position and will fail. His army will be splintered. It'll be forced north across the Dan River. He'll then hastily reassemble it, and at this point, he does not have sufficient force to maintain any kind of campaign in the south. And so he'll be forced to retreat to Yorktown, which will set up the famous Battle of Yorktown, which will conclude the American Revolution. Now, we want to keep in mind a couple of things about Yorktown. And here we have this, and I think I have... Now, the strategic position that Cornwallis finds himself in is not enviable. After the defeat at Guilford, he has approximately 5,000 men left. He will hastily march through Virginia to take up the defensive position at Yorktown, which already has about 3,500 British troops in it. It's their sole remaining defensive position in the south, okay, which will give them about 8,000 men. The French army, okay, with about 6,500 under Rochambeau, will arrive to invest Yorktown, meaning to lay siege to Yorktown. Okay, this is not a problem. This is not a problem because the plan is that Clinton, who's up here with 11,000 in New York, is going to send about 7,000 of them south to relieve Cornwallis's position in Yorktown and break the siege. Okay, supported by the British Navy, which has command over the waterways. Okay, at which point we're going to have Washington, who, as we've said, has been, sitting around desperately attempting to prevent a mutiny within his own troops in northern New Jersey, just kind of watching Clinton for the last 3 years. He'll now march south with about 7,500 men and reinforce the French position around Yorktown. Now, this is also not a problem. Now we have about 14,000 men between the French and American armies. Cornwallis is outnumbered. He only has 8,000, but with Clinton's reinforcements, that'll bring it to 15,000. And with even numbers like that, the defender definitely has the advantage in a siege. Yorktown is a strategically superior position. They have heavy artillery at their disposal. They'll be able to resist the siege easily, on the proviso that the British fleet can continue to supply the British position at Yorktown. Not a problem. The problem comes with de Grasse, who is commander of the French fleet. Up until now, from really 77, from really the fall of 77 onwards, what the French have been doing is a harassment campaign in the West Indies. They've just simply been harassing British shipping in the West Indies. They don't deceive themselves into believing that they'll be able to confront the British fleet and anticipate any kind of victory. In a slugfest, the French fleet is no match for the British. So they'll be harassing. Well, de Grasse is going to make a kind of a surprise move under the orders of Rochambeau. Rochambeau will order him north to complete the encirclement of Yorktown and prevent Clinton from reinforcing Cornwallis. Okay? The British don't see this as a particularly difficult position to be in because their fleet, after all, is superior. And so I encourage you to look at the animation, the detailed tactical analysis of what's called the Battle of the Capes, which is the naval battle off the coast of Virginia, which takes place, oddly enough, in a place very close to the battle between the Monitor and the Merrimack later on in the American Civil War. But at any rate, because the British know that in a slugfest they're superior to the French, they anticipate blowing the French fleet out and then being able to supply the position and reinforce it to their heart's content. The problem is that they've underestimated de Grasse. What the British anticipate is a slugfest with the French fleet, which they will win. De Grasse has no intention of engaging in such a contest because he knows he'll lose it. Instead, what he does is they enter in, and you'll see this in the tactical detail. They enter into your classic line-in formation, okay, where the British anticipate a slugfest. But what de Grasse does is he loads his weapons, he loads his artillery, okay, his guns, with chain shot. Now, for those of you that don't know, chain shot is when you take 2 cannonballs and chain them together, put them into the gun, it fires, the cannonballs break apart, extending the chain, and anything they hit, they'll rip to shreds. Okay? De Grasse then orders his men to fire high. Okay? His intention is to rip the British sails apart. Rather than engaging in a slugfest, immobilize the British fleet. Then, with a maneuverability advantage, the French fleet has a better chance of prevailing in the contest. He'll do this in the opening rounds of the engagement and rake the British fleet, demobilizing large portions of it. Okay? The British realize now that they've lost the strategic and tactical advantage. They'll begin to try to retreat, okay, back up to New York. De Grasse has achieved his end. He's driven the British fleet out, so he does not pursue them. Instead, he joins the investment of Yorktown and completes the siege. At which point Cornwallis reviews the tactical situation. He now realizes that he's completely screwed. Okay? The reinforcements from New York that he's been anticipating are not going to arrive. The French and American position now outnumbers him 2-1. At which point he comes to the conclusion that his position is untenable and he surrenders. Now, when he surrenders, He does not surrender. The way it's done is you turn your sword over. The British officers all have swords. You turn your sword over to your counterpart, okay? And that's the surrender, and then your troops are allowed to leave with the honors of war. When he turns his sword over, he doesn't turn it over to Washington, for whom he has absolutely no respect, for reasons that we've seen, probably rightly so. He turns his sword over to Rochambeau, and he doesn't turn it over. He sends a lieutenant out to turn his sword over to Rochambeau. Rochambeau refuses it, directing it to Washington. Okay, you need to turn it over to the American commander. Washington refuses it because his pride is hurt. Okay, he refuses to accept the sword from Cornwallis's lieutenant. He'll only take it from Cornwallis himself, his counterpart, his equal. Cornwallis didn't view Washington in any way as an equal. Okay, so instead, Washington will direct for it to be turned over to one of his lieutenants, which it is, and Cornwallis surrenders his position. And with the surrender of the position at Yorktown, the British realize that their position is untenable. They will remain in New York for another 2 years, okay, until the negotiated settlement of the revolution. Negotiations will open almost immediately in Paris, and the British will remain in New York. Actually, the last British forces won't leave New York until 1785. But they'll remain in New York City. And with that will be the conclusion of the revolution and the conclusion of this lecture.